Welcome to THINKpod. My name is Francisco.
And I'm Aziz, and at ThinkPod, we speak about the smartest ideas and the biggest challenges facing the world right now. We speak about where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. In this episode of ThinkPod, our guest is Christina Roosen, Chief Strategy Officer at Dedalus International. We look at the intersection of healthcare and technology. We discuss the tricky balance between regulation, consent, and trust between the healthcare sector and patients.
We hear a lot of buzzwords around digihealth and telehealth, but what does that actually mean? Like, how has the patient experience changed from 10 years ago?
This is a really good question. It's actually, let's say, something that's a bit close to my heart. Healthcare, we still talk about digital and healthcare. The merge between the two just haven't really happened yet, except when COVID all of a sudden happened. And we saw, look, there's all this innovation that's happening in this space. The medical field, the clinicians really want to use all the innovation, but we're lacking kind of the roadmap to make it happen. It's a lot of money as well in this space. Lots of investors want to invest. I think this is such an exciting space to be in, digital health, if we call it. I just like calling it healthcare. Because it's the next new sector to be transformed, to be digitalized.
So you seem very passionate about a converging world, right? You're talking about technology converging with healthcare, right? Can you elaborate more from your background and just from your life, what gravitated you towards both of these topics and ultimately brought you to the place that you are right now?
Well, it's going to be a little bit of a story, if you don't mind.
Of course, I love stories.
My father's a medical doctor, and I'm from Denmark. And I don't know if it is still the case, but it was quite normal those days for young doctors to go and sort of practice abroad when they graduated. So first, I moved with my family to Greenland. You know, Greenland is a part of Denmark, and we quite quickly realized that the cold, we had enough of that back home. So we got on a plane and we went to Botswana. So I grew up in a rural village in Botswana, where my father was a medical doctor in the clinic there. And the best time for me would be after school, running down there with my dog and looking at him helping people. I just thought there was sort of a magical moment in that. So in my whole childhood, I was absolutely sure I was going to be a doctor. And fast forward many years back in Denmark, and I did an internship in a hospital. The moment I saw blood, I just fainted. And I kept on it. I thought, okay, I'm an amateur at this. Let's give it another go. But it was just, it was too graphic for me. And so sadly, I thought I have to give up my dream here of being in the health sector. My mother was a diplomat, so I was sort of dragged a little bit around the world, and then I went sort of that direction with my education into sort of international politics, and then I was working in a public affairs company in Brussels, and someone comes in and says, look, we have a client, it's something called e-health, we don't really know what it is, but they're doing an event in Copenhagen, and you're Danish. And so I thought, this sounds kind of interesting, and this was in 2008. Just to talk about the sort of digitalization of healthcare has not happened. And that was an American organization called HIMSS, and I joined them. And then I just felt, I found my space here because it's healthcare, but it's digital. So I don't need to see blood. I don't need to cut anything. I've been in this sector ever since. I worked for many years in the non-for-profits, sort of traveling around the world, talking about how to transform your healthcare via digital, creating better outcomes with technology and digital solutions. As catastrophist, do you say that in English?
Catastrophic.
We do now.
As catastrophic, that was the word. COVID it was really the push that was needed to say, okay, we've been talking about transforming healthcare with technology for 10 years. Now we're actually going to make it happen. So this is such an exciting tipping point now. I see how telemedicine, for example, during COVID, I did a conference on telemedicine in 2008, and lots of talk about it since then. Now it's happened. And also I think because governments were behind it. They said, look, we have to, because the doctors were convinced about telemedicine, but they were not reimbursed for doing telemedicine consultations. Patients practically didn't know there was something called telemedicine solutions. So if you were a single mother with 3 children and in the middle of the night one of your children wake up dying of fever, you have to pack all the other kids in a car, go to a hospital where probably there's a lot of things in the air that you don't want to be exposed to, wait, all this stuff, where what you can actually do, open your laptop, connect with a doctor. Now with, more and more innovation coming in this, you can have drones coming and dropping off prescriptions at your home, and healthcare does not have to be so complicated. And it's happening now. It's being transformed by telehealth, artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing. And I'm humbled and overwhelmed at seeing how finally the healthcare sector is really transforming with technology.
So at the THINKpod, we pride ourselves in asking the tough questions.
Yes.
About the more pressing challenges. And I just wanted to ask you, right? So you talked about how COVID perhaps was a push to move more towards telemedicine. In the last 2 decades, perhaps, we've had a lot of close calls. We had the SARS fear, we had the swine flu come out. In the region, we had MERS, we had Zika more recently in terms of infectious diseases. Do you really think COVID was a necessary evil that might get us to a brighter future, where governments and lawmakers and people in positions of power are going to start incorporating more and more technology and making healthcare more accessible to more and more people?
Absolutely. It was a bit sad that was what was the necessary factor, but this is sometimes what makes great things happen, are big crises. And I think a lot of sectors clearly really suffered, but I absolutely think this was the push, because the reason why the healthcare sector has not transformed as quickly as others is that it's so heavily regulated. Coming from Europe, we love regulations. And when you look at the largest tech companies in the world, I think 8 or 9 are from the US, where there's less regulation. So I think that sort of speaks to itself a little bit. But I think we were in a unique situation where, in 12 months, we came together globally, developed a vaccine, and rolled out 1 billion vaccines across the world in 12 months. Think about what it typically takes to develop, all of this. Another thing that we learned from COVID is that you cannot just solve a pandemic on a local level. The challenges we share when it comes to healthcare are global. I mean, now in Europe, in my country, in Denmark, we have no restrictions. In Spain, where I live, there's still social distancing, there's masks, but we still travel to each other countries. So, and now in Europe, we're facing sort of what looks like I'm losing track, 4th or 5th wave. So we have to face the transformation of healthcare in technology together, I think, and this is a big moment.
In terms of regulation in Europe, is there a reform that you would like to see similar to what you have in the United States? Do you think that would have the right outcomes in terms of patient health, or what are your thoughts?
It's of course absolutely necessary. I mean, if we talk about vaccines, absolutely necessary that we trust our governments, that they're saying, okay, the vaccines that you're putting in your arm once or twice, they're not going to kill you. But it's this balance that you have to take care of the individual, you have to take care of the market, and of course also now the sort of third element I would say is this whole sort of cyber crime. But the one thing that I think is stopping us a bit in Europe is the whole thing about consent. I think you both know that when you book a flight, when you do anything, this thing comes up saying, do you consent? When was the last time you actually read a consent form?
I would think never.
Never.
Never. Yeah.
So you can say that a regulation has been made to protect you as an individual because you give consent, but do we actually know? And someone said that if a normal person in 1 week that interacts normally with the internet was to read all the consent forms that you're presented with, it would be the equivalent of reading 2 editions of Macbeth in 1 week, both in terms of size and in terms of the complexity of the language. My point is that if you impose regulations, it has to maybe be something where it's understandable for people. It's like more approachable for a normal human being, what it is that you're giving a consent to.
Right.
But maybe also we should ask consumers, look, maybe you want to actually give your data for this specific purpose without just immediately putting down that wall. Because if we don't have the data, we can't fuel all this new innovation, artificial intelligence and so on. It's a very delicate balance because yes, we need regulation. The United States has its own thoughts when it comes to regulation. Then of course there's China and other places. But learning from experiences and finding a common ground, I think, is the way forwards.
Do you have any concerns about the misuse of data, so selling it or leaking data?
We need to follow the highest standards of data protection. And of course, we've seen some pretty horrible things happen.
Absolutely.
But in healthcare, if you can do net banking, if you can have all your financial information in the cloud, because I can't remember last time I physically went into a bank and did a transaction, I think we have to reach that same point with healthcare, because there's this barrier saying health data is so sensitive, and it is. But if we can do it with banking and other industries that really, or defense industries, for example, and we should be able to apply sort of the best practices from those and impose them in other areas where there's sensitive data as well.
So you talked about both the banking industry as well as the defense industry, right? Both of them are renowned to have a lot of ransomware, a lot of cyber attacks. Yeah. I think research shows that there's an increasing amount of attacks on hospitals as well.
Yes.
Do you think that puts the well-being of both the providers and the patients at risk? What can we do to convince people that this is a problem that we can overcome?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And especially during COVID, it was just crazy. But I think the discovery was that there was not good enough protection of healthcare data. Healthcare was something the cyber attackers thought, hey, here's an area that's, it's got good potential for cyber attacks, that's very, very vulnerable. But I think there's a lot being done now to protect healthcare data. And I think it's, again, about having that trust in our institutions. Yeah, when you allow a hospital or a physician to manage your data, you have a certain level of trust that it will be managed. Just like when you get up in an airplane, you trust that the pilot has access to real-time data and will guide you safely through the air. But I think there was a vulnerability there in cyberspace, and that's something that's being addressed on a global level at a very, very serious.
In terms of trust, obviously banks typically rate low on trust. How does healthcare or digital healthcare providers build that trust?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Yeah, because I think healthcare is a funny one, because when you walk into a hospital, or if you see someone, they call it sort of the white coat syndrome, you wear the white coat, you immediately just think, here's a person I trust. I think as patients and citizens are becoming more informed, there is this challenging a little bit of the clinicians, where maybe you'll say, well, but I read on the internet that maybe I can have a different kind of treatment, or maybe some alternative treatment, or so on. I suppose also it depends a little bit where you live and so on. And the countries that I come from and where I live, there's just a very high level of trust in general to your government. But I'm an eternal optimist. Clinicians, they sign something when they take up this task saying, I will do my best to save lives. And I just think we should have the trust in them that they're doing the best they can to make that happen.
I wanted to ask you a tough question again.
Oh.
The pandemic really brought us to the forefront with the pharmaceutical companies, right? And historically, we've had a very mixed relationship with them. There's good that comes out from there, there's a lot of bad that comes out of there as well. In that kind of an ecosystem, and given how dependent perhaps we became of them during the COVID pandemic to kind of rescue us out of that phase and get us out to a new normal that we're living right now, do you think that those kind of trust barriers that a lot of people are building with healthcare industry at a broader level can be addressed? So
again, as you said, I think COVID was I hate to say, but sort of a good example of how that trust can be built in a really, really fast way. And this was, of course, a particular situation because it was sort of come what may. We need this to solve so many other problems that this pandemic is causing. So we have no choice in a sense. Then we just have to trust that they're doing the best. But I think it's hopefully created something that will make it easier for the future. Now we can also do clinical trials on a computer, which I think is just hugely exciting. And I think the pharma companies are also really moving fast into the digital space, which again provides perhaps for more transparency with many of the things around data that were maybe questionable before in the past. So I think the whole thing has accelerated the speed of new technology, new pharmaceuticals coming into the markets. Also, I think there's been an increase of trust between sort of the healthcare sector and patients and citizens in general.
In terms of moving and adapting to the environment, healthcare and the government generally as well is quite slow to adapt. Do you think it's companies and corporations that will be leading that reform?
I definitely think that there's going to be a big push for that. In Europe, there's a lot of talk about the cloud and also, data sovereignty. Because as we talked about in the beginning, the largest cloud providers in the world are American, and they're excellent at what they do. And they've been doing it for many years. So in Europe, we don't really have any competition to that. But it also means that you're putting all the data up in a cloud that's regulated by a foreign company. Data is so sensitive also because it's generated from human beings. It's not something that we pick up from the earth. It's a commodity that we need to protect from a sort of sovereign situation.
So one question, Christina, we were very passionate about healthcare overall at the FI Institute. And one of the initiatives that we launched was a Global Infectious Disease Index,
yes,
which basically gathers data in real time about countries' preparedness for both endemics and pandemics, puts it into one tool and makes it accessible to the world. How can we promote more and more people, both on the policymaking side, business side, as well as everyday citizens, to adopt to these kind of tools and methodologies and volunteer their data that's in the benefit of humanity at a broader level?
It's a good question because I think it requires more incentivizing. If you look at your apps you have on your phone, maybe 2 of them will be healthcare related. They might not be the ones you check on a daily basis, but you might go and check your net banking on a daily basis, or the stocks that you've invested in, or Bitcoin, or whatever. So I think we need to find smart ways of incentivizing individuals to provide more data, given that they've given consent to do it, of course.
In terms of a final question, what personal legacy would you like to leave for future generations?
On a personal level, I would say I would like to see more women in this field, especially when you come into my sector on technology and healthcare. You lose women, unfortunately. So I would like to be sort of an ambassador for that, and to say, for someone who's passionate about healthcare, for creating better outcomes for patients, it's really interesting and innovative. I would certainly like to invite more women to be part of this journey.
We would like to thank you so much for being our guest today. Very enlightening. And again, thank you so much, Christina. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
We would love you to let others know about this podcast.
So please rate us, leave us a comment, and share with someone who might enjoy it too.
And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next episode.